You want me to warm up your tea?
No, thanks. Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And tonight's topics are negotiate in Ukraine, the end of the war in Gaza, and Russia's big move. Let's start out by, if you'll excuse me, by sharing to Facebook. And then I'm going to begin with Russia's big move. I'm going to begin with a little video about Russia's big move. So this is a clip.
Trip to North Korea this week.
This is a clip from Judging Freedom. And you heard the question, what is the significance, of Russia, of Putin's trip, to North Korea, right after he made
he changed
peace
the world.
Offering to the West.
I think
So let me back up just a little here.
he changed the world. I think he did a lot to save all of our necks, because regardless of...
That is Dr. Gil Doctorow, PhD, Professor of International Affairs. He's an analyst of international affairs and an author, and a historian. He says that Putin did much to save our necks.
how it's being played by the mainstream media, there are people surely in the Pentagon who understood this as I understand it. The game is up. I say media. I just read the Financial Times this morning, their lead article dealing with the conclusion, and you wouldn't know that anything in particular happened in Pyongyang. Yes, they rolled out the red carpet. Yes, they sang songs. They sang Russian patriotic songs and so on and so forth. But as to the substance of what was signed, very little was described in the Financial Times. When I picked up our lead French-speaking newspaper here in Belgium, Le Soir, and they had an article appraising what was accomplished or not, and they said, well, at least we can breathe easy. There was no military alliance concluded. But my friends, that's exactly what they did conclude.
Right.
And it's not my estimation. On Russian news last night, they have still in Pyongyang, they gave the microphone to Sergei Lavrov. And Lavrov said, yes, the term isn't there, but the substance, the reality is this is a military alliance. We are allies. End of story.
What did you mean in your initial answer to my question? He saved the world. Please explain, Professor Doctorow.
I think he's made it impossible for the neocons who run the show in the State Department and in the Biden administration more broadly to carry out what they thought was an easy shot. They have got the Russians in a corner, and the corner is in the southwest, in the western part of Europe. Russia is in a morass, that it will be stuck in that morass for years to come, and the United States can proceed with its preferred scenario of how to maintain its global.
Okay, I've been having a little trouble with my page here. Okay, but I think you hear the theory. And you see the theory to some degree. Basically, even though Russia may be preoccupied in Ukraine now for some time, still, if there are any attacks by the neocons on China, okay, or any attacks on Russian interests in the Far East, then there's a military alliance with North Korea now to help to defend Russia's interests in the Far East. And North Korea is a major nuclear power with major nuclear technology, which is now being enhanced by Russia. In particular, hang on a second, let me see if I can refresh this page and get some control over it. Shouldn't be having that much trouble with it. I'm only using half my memory. So it shouldn't be a problem. Okay, but according to some other streams that have appeared on this, the Russians have already given the North Koreans a very capable intercontinental ballistic missile called the Topol. It's a solid fuel missile. It's very hard to pick out because it can be hidden behind trees or almost anywhere, and it's very hard for satellites to see because it's a solid fuel missile. It's hard for them to detect. And it's a missile that can reach almost any part of the United States. So Putin was basically saying to the West, in making this particular change, in creating this alliance, okay, he was saying to the West, okay, so you're preparing to attack us from other sites, which are very close to us, and distributing weapons, your weapons, okay, to other parties who are going to try to attack us from their territory with your weapons. And you're distributing very advanced weapons, okay, to Ukraine. We can do the same thing. And here's an example of what we can do with our new military alliance with North Korea. And there are other examples of what we can do as well. So, the military alliance with North Korea is very important. It's something of a coup. It wasn't anticipated by the West. Why are these things not anticipated by the West? Why are they a surprise? And evidently a surprise. Well, one of our well-known commentators, in this case, Larry Wilkerson, Colonel Wilkerson, recently suggested that it's because our decision makers only seem to think about what we can do. They only spend time imagining what we can do to our opponents. They don't spend any time thinking about what they can do in response to us. That's why making a military alliance with North Korea was such a surprise. That's why I'm making common cause, or the Russians making common cause with Iran, has been evidently such a surprise to us. Uh, that's probably why the Houthis suddenly attacking Israel was such a surprise to us. We never seem to consider one of the uh, one of the possible responses that there can be to our actions, and one of the responses that are just as justified as our actions. It's very interesting. That was Putin's big move. Let us go from there to the issue of negotiations. Specifically, let's look at a piece contributed by Jeffrey Sachs. What he's talking about, of course, is the speech that JFK gave at American University back in, I believe it was in 1962. Sachs has made a great study of this speech, and he's written a whole book about it.
(1963). This was the
Sorry, I should have been sharing that, of course.
absolute height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred just a few months earlier in October 1962. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two nuclear superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, had come within a hair's breadth of nuclear war that would have led to a global nuclear annihilation. I'll say a word about that in a moment. But this is a speech in the aftermath of that. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended peacefully, essentially thanks to Kennedy and his counterpart in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Both of them had advisors who thought that war was inevitable in October 1962. As most of you will know, when Kennedy was presented with the pictures taken by a U-2 spy plane over Cuba showing the placement of missile sites in Cuba by the Soviet Union, Kennedy convened an executive committee, XCOM, it became famously called. And in XCOM, we have the transcripts and the tapes, actually, of the sessions. And what is startling about XCOM is that at the start, almost every single advisor of President Kennedy was in favor of a military strike in Cuba to be launched within hours or days of this finding of missile sites. The CIA said that the missiles were not yet operational. This was almost surely wrong. Most of the intelligence in detail was wrong. The number of Soviet troops on the ground in Cuba was much larger than the CIA believed.
Have you ever wondered why the CIA is almost always wrong when it comes to important judgments about going on? I've often wondered about that. They've been wrong about so many things. They were wrong about the strength of the Viet Cong in North Vietnam. Generally speaking, they were wrong about the strength of the Soviet Union in various areas. In more recent years, they've been wrong about the capabilities of Russia, continuously wrong about the capabilities of Russia. And I think they're misjudging the capabilities of the Chinese too.
The chance that such a strike would have led to a nuclear exchange and ultimately to a full-scale nuclear war was extraordinarily high. And yet, based on wrong instincts, wrong intelligence, and a failure to understand and think through this crisis, almost all of the advisors at the beginning said that there was no option but a military option. Khrushchev was, of course, surrounded by advisors who felt that war was also extraordinarily likely. In the end, Kennedy delayed. He asked himself constantly, why did the Soviets do this? What is Chairman Khrushchev thinking? And how do we get out of this without destroying the world? And in the end, as you know, an agreement was reached.
By the way, I was in graduate school at that time, at Michigan State, studying for my degree in international relations and comparative politics. And I was in the streets in Lansing, Michigan. I had organized a protest. Must have had 30 students protesting in the capital city of Michigan, in Lansing. Because I was going to Michigan State University, and they're in East Lansing, Michigan. So it's very easy to go down to the center of Lansing, to protest, to demonstrate. And one of the things that we were advocating for while we were protesting, we had, specific demands we were calling for. What we were calling for was a trade of the missiles the Russians had in Cuba with the Jupiter missiles that we had in Greece and Turkey. Anyway.
Partly public, partly secret. One part of the agreement was that the United States would never again try to invade Cuba as it had done in the Bay of Pigs invasion in the spring of 1961. The Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles, and secretly the United States agreed after a few months' space that it would withdraw the U.S. Missiles in Turkey that were aimed at the Soviet Union. So there was a reciprocity to it, which unfortunately was not learned by the public for decades afterwards. So there was a public perception that the United States had fully forced the Soviet Union to back down, whereas in fact there was a true compromise reached with the nuclear missile sites removed from both sides. But what had happened was a near miracle that through reason, through a steady hand through Kennedy's belief that Khrushchev was also trying to find a
Okay, sorry, folks. I have to do something right now. I'll be right back. Okay, I have to mute my phone for just a moment. Okay, I'm back. Let me get to Jeffrey Sachs again.
peaceful way out through the very good work and advice of a few others, notably the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, and the UN Secretary General, Utant. This diplomatic solution was reached. And of course, in the final days, President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, played a very important role in opening a back channel to the Soviet ambassador in Washington to help make the arrangements for this diplomatic solution. So the speech is in the backdrop of nearly ending the world. And after those events, Khrushchev and Kennedy, I think both appreciated that they uniquely in the world had a responsibility to pull the world back from the brink. And they also had a kind of mutual respect by that point, after having nearly come to complete Armageddon. They realized that each other had pulled back and used reason and in effect trusted the counterpart. And so there was a certain belief by both that they could reach an agreement. This speech was part of Kennedy's campaign in 1963 to pull back from the brink. And that was both in aim of some specific achievements, notably a test ban treaty that would stop nuclear testing, and also a more general desire to improve relations with the Soviet Union. So this speech should be seen as part of a peace campaign by President Kennedy to pull the United States and the Soviet Union back from the brink and to help the world to breathe again after the closest humanity has ever come to its self-destruction. Incidentally, there's a phenomenal book about the Cuban Missile Crisis written by the late and truly great historian Martin Sherwin. It's this book called Gambling with Armageddon, and I strongly recommend it. It's a thrilling read, but it's also an extraordinary historical accomplishment because Sherwin gets to the minute-by-minute understanding of what the different actors in this drama were thinking and how this worked. One of the things that he describes, which I said I would come back to briefly, is the fact that even after Kennedy and Khrushchev had reached this diplomatic accord, we almost had nuclear war by accident. And that was because, as many of you will know, but probably not all of you, there was a disabled Soviet submarine that had been sent to Cuba as part of this operation. It was disabled, it was submerged, and it was out of contact with Moscow. And it was suffering from overheating and a need to surface. And the captain of this submarine did not know whether there was a war going on the surface or not. It happened that this was a flotilla of 7, I believe, submarines of the Soviet Union in this location in the Caribbean. And in that flotilla, this was the single submarine that had a nuclear-tipped torpedo as part of its arsenal. As the submarine started to surface, depth charges were dropped on the submarine by the US Air Force. And the captain believed that the submarine was facing a war above the surface, and he ordered the nuclear-tipped torpedo into the torpedo bay. Under US military doctrine of that day, had such a weapon been used against the US, a nuclear weapon, the US doctrine was that the US would unleash its full nuclear arsenal at the Soviet Union, at the Central and Eastern European countries like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland that were in the Soviet bloc, and at mainland China. And the estimates of the day were that around 700 million people would die almost instantly. And the torpedo was in the bay about to be fired when the chief of staff of the flotilla said, maybe it's not a good idea to fire this, maybe we should surface. And his vote was needed among 3 of the officers to fire the torpedo. And he blocked it. And he saved the world. He's the unknown man who saved the world. I'd wager not too many of you would know the name Vasily Arkhipov, but he saved the world by saying, better not to fire, better we surface. Of course, when they surfaced, they found out that there was no war, and they made their way back to Russia, and the world was saved. So
that is, of course, an incredible story. It validates, of course, the use of diplomacy to solve the crisis, but it also validates the courage, of one man who stood against hasty decisions to start what was going to be a devastating nuclear war. Truly amazing. Which more than anything else makes the point. Negotiate. So let's leave that wonderful video by Jeffrey Sachs. The link is in the description. You can see the rest of it, for yourself. Let's move to an article now by Jeffrey Sachs. Yes, Robert, it wouldn't take much to go wrong. We have to remember that right now, there are nuclear subs on both sides. The sub that Jeffrey Sachs was talking about there was not a nuclear sub. It had a nuclear-tipped torpedo. But the Soviets didn't have nuclear subs at that time. Now both sides have fleets of nuclear submarines. We have a big advantage in technology with respect to those particular submarines. They're the one area where we still have a military advantage over the opposition. But of course, the incident emphasizes the possibility that in using nuclear submarines, there is perhaps a greater potential for accident, for some surprising accident to occur, which leads to a nuclear war in which hundreds of millions of people are destroyed, which would be devastating for both sides. Though currently, most probably more devastating for the United States, because of course, we don't have the hypersonic missiles right now. We're at a military disadvantage compared to the Russians. Let us now go on to Jeffrey Sachs's article. It's from Common Dreams, and it asks, why won't the U.S. help negotiate a peaceful end to the war in Ukraine? And in the subtitle, he says, for goodness sake, negotiate. This was done on June 19th, 2024. For the fifth time since 2008, Russia has proposed to negotiate with the U.S. over security arrangements, this time in proposals made by President Vladimir Putin on June 14th, 2024. Four previous times, the United States rejected the offer of negotiations in favor of a neocon strategy to weaken or dismember Russia through war and covert operations. The U.S. neocon tactics have failed disastrously, devastating Ukraine in the process and endangering the whole world. After all the warmongering, it's time for Biden to be open to negotiations for peace with Russia. Since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. grand strategy has been to weaken Russia. As early as 1992, then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, opined that following the 1991 demise of the Soviet Union, Russia too should be dismembered. Zbigniew Brzezinski opined in 1997 that Russia should be divided into three loosely confederated entities in Russia, Russian Europe, Siberia, and the Far East. In 1999, the U.S.-led NATO alliance bombed Russia's ally for 78 days. Russia's ally Serbia for 78 days in order to break Serbia apart and install a massive military base in breakaway Kosovo. Leaders of the U.S. military-industrial complex vociferously supported the Chechen war against Russia in the early 2000s. To secure these U.S. advances against Russia, Washington aggressively pushed NATO enlargement, despite promises to Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward from Germany. Most tendentiously, the U.S. pushed NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia, with the idea of surrounding Russia's naval fleet in Sevastopol, Crimea, with NATO states. Ukraine, Romania, NATO member 2004, Bulgaria, NATO member 2004, Turkey, NATO member 1952, and Georgia, an idea straight from the playbook of the British Empire in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. Brzezinski spelled out a chronology of NATO enlargement in 1997, including NATO membership of Ukraine during 2005 to 2010. The U.S., in fact, proposed NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia at the 2008 NATO Bucharest summit. By 2020, NATO had in fact enlarged by 14 countries in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union: Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland in 1999, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic Chihuahuas, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. He didn't say it Baltic Chihuahuas. I added that little comment from Pepe Escobar. Albania and Croatia 2009, also Montenegro 2017, and Northern Macedonia in 2020, while promising future membership to Ukraine and Georgia. Now, that's not very aggressive foreign policy, is it? In short, the 30-year U.S. project hatched originally by Cheney, who else, and the neocons, and carried forward consistently since then, has been to weaken or dismember Russia, surround Russia with NATO forces, and depict Russia as the belligerent power. It is against this grim backdrop that Russian leaders have repeatedly proposed to negotiate security arrangements with Europe and the US that would provide security for all countries concerned, not just the NATO bloc. Guided by the neocon game plan, the US has refused to negotiate on every occasion, while trying to pin the blame on Russia for the lack of any negotiations. In June 2008, as the US prepared to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev proposed a European security treaty calling for collective security and an end to NATO's unilateralism. Suffice it to say, the U.S. showed no interest whatsoever in Russia's proposal and instead proceeded with its long-held plans for NATO enlargement. The second Russian proposal for negotiations came from Putin following the violent overthrow of Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, in February 2014, with the active complicity, if not outright leadership, of the U.S. government. I happened to see the U.S. complicity up close, as the post-coup government invited me for urgent economic discussions. When I arrived in Kyiv, I was taken to the Maidan, where I was told directly about U.S. funding of the Maidan protest. The evidence of U.S. complicity in the coup is overwhelming. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland was caught on a phone line in January 2014, plotting the change of government in Ukraine. Meanwhile, U.S. senators went personally to Kyiv to stir up the protests akin to Chinese or Russian leaders coming to D.C. on January 6, 2021 to rile up the crowds. On February 21st, 2014, the Europeans, U.S., and Russia brokered a deal with Yanukovych in which he agreed to early elections. Yet the coup leaders reneged on the deal the same day, took over government buildings, threatened more violence, and deposed Yanukovych the next day. The U.S. supported the coup and immediately extended recognition to the new government. In my view, this was a standard CIA-led covert regime change operation, of which there have been several dozen around the world, including 64 episodes between 1947 and 1989, meticulously documented by Professor Lindsay O'Rourke. Covert regime change operations are, of course, not really hidden from view, but the U.S. government vociferously denies its role, keeps all documents highly confidential, and systematically gaslights the world. Quote, do not believe what you see plainly with your own eyes. Maybe I should add your own lying eyes to that. The U.S. had nothing to do with this, unquote. Details of the operations eventually emerge, however, through eyewitness whistleblowers, the forced release of documents under the Freedom of Information Act, declassification of papers after years or decades, and memoirs, but all far too late for real accountability. In any event, the violent coup induced the ethnic Russia Donbass region of eastern Ukraine to break from the coup leaders, many of whom were extreme Russophobic but nationalists, excuse me, and some in violent groups with a history of Nazi SS links in the past. Almost immediately, the coup leaders took steps to repress the use of the Russian language, even in the Russian-speaking Donbass. In the following months and years, the government in Kiev launched a military campaign to retake the breakaway regions, deploying neo-Nazi paramilitary units and U.S. arms. By the way, folks, there's no doubt about that. The neo-Nazis were inspired by the Nazi affiliates in World War II, and particularly the Ukrainian Nazi Stefan Bandera. These were the Banderites, who were the muscle behind the coup in 2014. Going on with the article, in the course of 2014, Putin called repeatedly for a negotiated peace, and this led to the Minsk II agreement in February 2015, based on autonomy of the Donbass and an end to violence by both sides. Russia did not claim the Donbass as Russian territory, but instead called for autonomy and the protection of ethnic Russians within Ukraine. The UN Security Council endorsed the Minsk II agreement, but the US neocons privately subverted it. Years later, Chancellor Angela Merkel blurted out the truth. The Western side treated the agreement not as a solemn treaty, but as a delaying tactic to, quote, give Ukraine time, unquote, to build its military strength. In the meantime, around 14,000 people died in the fighting in Donbass between 2014 and 2021. Following the definitive collapse of the Minsk agreement, Putin again proposed to negotiate with the U.S. in December 2021. By that point, the issues went even beyond NATO enlargement to include fundamental issues of nuclear armament. Step by step, the U.S. neocons had abandoned nuclear arms control with Russia, with the U.S. unilaterally abandoning the anti-ballistic missile ABM treaty in 2002, placing Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania in 2010 onwards, and walking out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force INF Treaty in 2019. In view of these dire concerns, Putin put on the table on December 15, 2021, a draft, quote, treaty between the United States of America and the Russian Federation on security guarantees, unquote. The most immediate issue on the table, Article 4 of the draft treaty, was the end of the U.S. attempt to expand NATO to Ukraine. I called U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. At the end of 2021, I called, means, of course, Jeffrey Sachs called, the end of 2021 to try to convince the Biden White House to enter the negotiations. My main advice was to avoid a war in Ukraine by accepting Ukraine's neutrality rather than NATO membership, which was a bright red line for Russia. The White House flatly rejected the advice, claiming remarkably and obtusely that NATO's enlargement to Ukraine was none of Russia's business. Yet what would the U.S. say if some country in the Western Hemisphere decided to host Chinese or Russian bases? Would the White House, State Department, or Congress say, that's just fine, that's a matter of concern only to Russia or China and the host country? For example, what if this was done in Mexico? And what if Mexico hosted Chinese or Russian bases? Would we say that's just fine, that's a matter of concern only to Russia or China and the host country? Going on with the article. No. The world nearly came to nuclear Armageddon in 1962 when the Soviet placed nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the U.S. imposed a naval quarantine and threatened war unless the Russians removed their missiles. The U.S. military alliance does not belong in Ukraine any more than the Russian or Chinese military belongs close to the U.S. border. I think that's obvious. Don't all of you think that's obvious? That's so obvious in terms of how we would act if that happened. The fourth offer of Putin to negotiate came in March 2022, when Russia and Ukraine nearly closed a peace deal just weeks after the start of Russia's special military operation that began on February 24th, 2022. Russia, once again, was after one big thing: Ukraine's neutrality, i.e., no NATO membership, and no hosting of U.S. missiles on Russia's border. Ukraine's president, Vladimir Zelensky, quickly accepted Ukraine's neutrality, and Ukraine and Russia exchanged papers with the skillful mediation of the Foreign Ministry of Turkey. Then suddenly, at the end of March, Ukraine abandoned the negotiations. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, following in the tradition of British anti-Russian warmongering dating back to the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, quietly flew to Kyiv to warn Zelensky against neutrality and the importance of Ukraine defeating Russia on the battlefield. Since that date, Ukraine has lost around 500,000 dead and is on the ropes on the battlefield. I think it's lost more like 600,000 dead. But now we have Russia's fifth order of negotiations, explained clearly and cogently by Putin himself in his speech to diplomats at the Russian Foreign Ministry on June 14th. Putin laid out Russia's proposed terms to end the war in Ukraine. Quote, Ukraine should adopt a neutral, non-aligned status, be nuclear-free, and undergo demilitarization and denazification, Putin said, unquote, Putin said. Quote again, these parameters were broadly agreed upon during the Istanbul negotiations in 2022, including specific details on demilitarization, such as the agreed number of tanks and other military equipment. We reached consensus on all points. Quote again, certainly the rights, freedoms, and interests of Russian-speaking citizens in Ukraine must be fully protected, unquote. And he continued, quote again, the new territorial realities, including the status of Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, and Luhansk People's Republics, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions as part of the Russian Federation should be acknowledged. These foundational principles need to be formalized through fundamental international agreements in the future. Naturally, this entails the removal of all Western sanctions against Russia as well. Let me say a few words about actually negotiating. Russia's proposals should now be met at the negotiating table by proposals from U.S. and Ukraine. The White House is dead wrong to evade any negotiations just because of disagreements with Russia's proposals. It should put up its own proposals and get down to the business of negotiating an end to the war. There are three core issues for Russia: Ukraine's neutrality, non-NATO enlargement, Crimea remaining in Russian hands, and boundary changes in eastern and southern Ukraine. The first two are almost surely non-negotiable. The end of NATO enlargement is the fundamental casus belli. Crimea is also core for Russia, as Crimea has been home to Russia's Black Sea fleet since 1783 and is fundamental to Russia's national security. Since 1783, that, folks, is 240 years. No way the Russians are backing off that. The third core issue, the borders of eastern and southern Ukraine, will be a key point of the negotiations. The U.S. cannot pretend that borders are sacrosanct after NATO bombed Serbia in 1999 to relinquish Kosovo, and after the U.S. pressured Sudan to relinquish South Sudan. Yes, Ukraine's borders will be redrawn as the result of the 10 years of war, the situation on the battlefield, the choices of the local populations, and trade-offs made at the negotiating table. Biden needs to accept that to negotiate is not a sign of weakness. As Kennedy put it, quote, never negotiate out of fear, but never fear to negotiate, unquote. Ronald Reagan famously described his own negotiating strategy using a Russian proverb, quote, trust, okay, but verify, unquote. The neocon approach to Russia, delusional and hubristic from the start, lies in ruins. NATO will never enlarge to Ukraine and Georgia. Russia will not be toppled by a CIA covert operation. Ukraine is being horribly bloodied on the battlefield, often losing 1,000 or more dead and wounded in a single day. I have to comment there. Right now, for the last few weeks, those numbers have been 2,000 or more dead and wounded in a single day. It is totally unsustainable. Going on with the article. The failed neocon game plan brings us closer to nuclear Armageddon. Yet Biden still refuses to negotiate. Following Putin's speech, the U.S., NATO, and Ukraine firmly rejected negotiations once again. Biden and his team have still not relinquished the neocon fantasy of defeating Russia and expanding NATO to Ukraine. The Ukrainian people have been lied to time and time again by Zelensky and Biden and other leaders of NATO countries who tell them falsely and repeatedly that Ukraine would prevail on the battlefield, that there were no options to negotiate. Ukraine is now under martial law. The public is given no say about its own slaughter. For the sake of Ukraine's very survival and to avoid nuclear war, the President of the United States has one overriding responsibility today: negotiate. And that's it for that wonderful piece with the great historical background and the great common sense, which fits in perfectly with the video and perfectly with the desire for peace of both the people of Russia and the people of the United States. Since the 1960s, and before, but in spite of this desire for peace, it never comes about due to the military-industrial complex and due to the insatiable appetites of the Russia haters and more recently the neocons, who of course are the Russia haters. Let me move on now to the topic of the end of the war, in Gaza. Steve Wolfbrand says, good stuff, Joe. Thank you, Steve. Let me go through a few of the comments first here. Now, before I go on, I don't have infinite time here because I got to go help Dee out. So Russia made an alliance with one of the worst dictators, in the world. I kind of laughed because, I don't think Putin's a dictator. I think that Russia is governed by a collective. Putin has many advisors, many people he consults with. He is not a dictator in the traditional sense of the word. He's not a dictator in the way Stalin was. He plays rough in politics, no question about it. He may have killed a few people from time to time, and imprisoned others, but that doesn't mean he's one of the worst of dictators, in the world. I mean, certainly Mohammed bin Salman is worse. And certainly what Trump proposes to do to the United States is worse. So April says, I finally got a chance to see what Sachs looks like. Steve says the CIA flooded my city with crack cocaine in the 1980s. I know this for a fact. I believe you, Steve. And Bob Copeland says, I don't think either side will use nuclear weapons and both sides will lose in a nuclear war. Okay, I don't think either side will use nuclear weapons deliberately also, Robert. Okay, and Colonel Douglas McGregor also thinks that neither side is going to use nuclear weapons deliberately. But when we're on the point of nuclear weapons, in the way we are, when Russia is proposing to use tactical nuclear weapons, and when our nuclear doctrine is a first strike doctrine right now, I think accidents can happen. We are risking nuclear war right now, even though I may agree with you that I don't think that either side will deliberately use nuclear weapons. But there are nuclear missiles in the Baltic Chihuahuas. Who knows whether the safeguards are enough to stop some of those idiots from using nuclear weapons? Let me go on. Robert, it wouldn't take much to go wrong. Robert says, I have to leave for 6 p.m. at 6 p.m. for a meeting on Zoom. That's coming soon in 4 minutes. Kay says hi. All Robert says, what will the peace deal look like between Russia and Ukraine? Well, you've seen the proposal from Putin. It's going to look something like that because Russia has a commanding military position and the realities of the military position have to be acknowledged. It might not be just that way. I mean, Russia might be willing to make some concessions in the territorial areas, but I'm sure they won't be large. And there might be trades involved also. Kay says, good, Robert. And Steve says, hi, Kay. Kay says, hi, Steve. Steve Wolfbrand said 10% went to the big guy. That was the deal with Ukraine or the deal with China, whatever, I forget which. And what percentage of the Ukrainian people are actual Nazis? Probably only a very small percentage. I'd be surprised if it was more than 5% of the Ukrainian people. But they were still the muscle for the coup. And there are enough of them that they were very important to the effort of the Ukraine, the military effort of the Ukrainians. Where are they getting the numbers of 500,000 dead, Ukrainians in this article? Where there have been estimates made by Scott Ritter, and by Doug McGregor, two close observers of the war, who've done their own counts based on their own sources of numbers of casualties. Scott Ritter is talking 500,000 dead, and Colonel McGregor a few days ago said that he thought it was closer to 600,000, which is perfectly plausible because about a month and a half ago, they were both in agreement on the 500,000 dead. And as I said, the Ukrainians in recent weeks have been losing 2,000 people a day. So it's approaching 600,000. Steve says, good stuff, Joe. Robert Combs said, he's talking about the North Korean leader as one of the worst. I thought you were talking about Putin as one of the worst dictators in the world. Yeah. Okay, I think I can agree that the Korean leader is one of the worst, dictators in the world, but I still don't know whether he's worse than Mohammed bin Salman. I think we're in alliance with some pretty lousy dictators, and we have been for many, many years. Thank you for the correction, though, Robert. I do appreciate it. It made for a very good laugh, I think. Well, of course, it's a laugh at me because I'm the one who assumed the wrong thing. But here we go. Let's go on to the final topic, was ending the war in Gaza. So let me share the screen for that. I want to start
it's very interesting to see how the
I want to start with Pepe. I know now also, I'll go on with this for a few minutes, but I know now that I'm not going to be able to finish what I've started for tonight.
as always,
Specifically,
as always.
a great video to go through. First, a
If-
great video here with Pepe, but then another great video from Scott Ritter. And okay, I think I'm going to have a Saturday night show. Okay, so I think Dee probably won't have one. I'll probably have one at 9 o'clock tomorrow, either at 8, okay, or 9 o'clock, okay, tomorrow. And I have some articles of Pepe's to go through. I have this video of Pepe's to go through. And I have that great video of Scott Ritter's to go through also. So that's certainly going to be a relatively long show for tomorrow night. But for now, I will begin by going through this first video of Pepe's here, which is he's being interviewed, okay, on Nima Alkershid's show, okay, the Dialogue Works, which, as you know, a very good interview show. So
we learned that Hamas agreed on ceasefire resolution adopted by UN Security Council, that the Israeli government was not happy with that. They don't care what they're talking about right now. And how do you see the situation right now in Gaza, in Rafah? Can international community do anything to help Gazans?
Well, I wrote a long essay on the cradle. Well, I'm basically I ask a very uncomfortable question. How can we, in fact, building up on a previous column, how can we discuss and organize the coming of the multipolar world in the middle of a genocide? Nobody and no country.
a profound question. And we went over earlier in earlier streams, one of the earliest streams, the article, okay, that Pepe wrote about that.
No entity has answered this question, and even the BRICS. So this last column, I try to analyze the BRICS position as a whole on Gaza, especially the Russia-China approach. What the BRICS final statement during their meeting of foreign ministers last week here in Nizhny Novgorod. It's a very, very good final statement, and they have at least 2 long paragraphs about Gaza. Okay, all the right moves, all the right sentiment, etc., but there's nothing really practical on how to force the Israelis to end the genocide. And nobody can force them to end the genocide, because the only way to do that would be via a military operation. And
so I'm not sure that I agree with that nobody can force them. I've said in the past, and I still think, and this is especially true in the context of an attack by Hezbollah on Israel, okay, which may be coming up. If the Iranians join in with their missile capability aimed directly at the settlers, okay, in the West Bank, and okay, if that attack should drive out most of the settlers, it seems to me the ground would be clear. Well, first of all, I think as a result of that, probably Netanyahu's government would fall, and someone from the IDF, okay, would take over. And that someone from the IDF might be willing to negotiate a 2-state solution at that point in return for peace, because a lot of Israel would be devastated. Okay, the country would be open to total destruction. And finally, the Israelis might be prepared to negotiate a 2-state solution. Anyway, I go.
And we are very far away from having, for instance, a BRICS military force or an SCO military force, or a BRICS SCO, Eurasia Economic Union military force as a whole, an Eurasian military force, forcing the Israelis on the ground. Nobody wants a hot war with Israel. And everybody knows how deranged and totally out of control they are. And even worse, with nuclear weapons. One straightforward definition of Israel nowadays is ISIS with nuclear weapons. This is what they are.
ISIS with nuclear weapons. In other words, religious fanatics with nuclear weapons. Religious fundamentalists with nuclear weapons. Notice he says Israel nowadays. He knows Israel didn't used to be like this, but they are like this today.
They are. It's a terror entity, but nuclear. So it's very hard to subdue such entity.
Okay, is it a terror entity? Well, that's certainly the way they're acting, in Gaza. They've been totally terrorizing the population for months now. They've been terrorizing the population in the West Bank also since the beginning of the year, and before. They're targeting civilians all over the place. They're committing what looks like a genocide and almost certainly will be declared one by the International Court of Justice when it finally gets around to it.
And the BRICS, as the leaders, the organization coordinating the drive towards multipolarity, they haven't found an answer yet. There are a lot of nice moves, right moves, altruistic moves, etc., but it's not enough. And some of the BRICS, they play a very, very dodgy role because, they still have their contacts with Israel. There was a meeting last week which was absolutely crucial to unveil what's going on, behind the curtains. Organized by CENTCOM with the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and you had 5 Arab countries sitting on the table discussing with CENTCOM and with Israel, including BRICS members, Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. So what the hell were they doing at that table? Okay, you can always say, they're hedging their bets. They're trying not to antagonize completely the Americans. But you don't sit with Israel at the same table in the middle of a genocide. I'm sorry. That nothing legitimate.
Don't sit at the same table with Israel, in the middle of a genocide. I have to agree. Certainly, their populations, the populations of Egypt, the populations of Saudi, the populations of Jordan. None of those populations would agree that they should be sitting with Israel in the midst of a genocide. They should all be mobilizing to attack Israel to stop that genocide.
That. No, absolutely nothing, and especially 3 important Arab countries. So it's very, very complex. And obviously, Russia and China, they look at that and said, wow, we cannot even control the people in our club. Can you imagine outside? And of course, we have this fabulous engagement by Yemen, for instance, which is respected all across the lands of Islam because they're actually doing something tangible and practical to go against Israel.
The heroes, in Yemen, among the poorest people, in the world, are doing what they can to stop, the genocide. And the Saudis, far more prosperous. will not do anything concrete, and behind the scenes are still negotiating in favor of the Abrahamic Accords.
And this was amazing. In the process, they simply humiliated the US Navy in front of the whole planet. This is enormous. But the genocide continues, you see. Hezbollah, fantastic, as always. But now they have to be preparing themselves because Israel, in desperation, they are seriously considering opening a new front against Hezbollah. So Hezbollah, obviously, they have to think about how they are going to manage this possible next war and protect the civilian population in Lebanon. So it's impossible to control a rabid dog that starts going around and biting everyone around him. You know, it's very, very serious, and that's why no one, and not even a coalition of the global majority, let's put it the way, has found a way to deal with it. And the problem is, while they keep getting away with it, the genocide does not stop. And the rest of the planet, they look at it and said, but how can we be so impotent? Why nobody does anything about it? Exactly, because it's a very, very serious decision, and it will involve a major war with unforeseen consequences. It's the only way to stop these people.
Yeah, we've learned that United States.
So I think Pepe has a very good position on that. Scott Ritter also has, a very good position on that. But to find out about Scott Ritter's position and his thinking on that, we'll have to wait for tomorrow night, because I have to take the last of your comments and I have to go over and help Dee, with her show. But I hope you enjoyed this show so far. Tomorrow night, what will be on the agenda is going through this video, doing commentary on it, doing the commentary, on the video from Judging Freedom, where Scott Ritter was the guest, and also tackling the two of Pepe's articles that he has recently published. So that's what's on tap for tomorrow night, at 9 p.m. I think it'll be 9 p.m., but, look out for me on Twitter. When I get to Twitter, I'll have the exact time. Then. Right now, though, I'm going to go over to your final comments. And then I will go over to these. Robert said, see you later, as I got to go. Steve Wolfbrand says, good night. Robert K says, night, Robert. See you guys later. Steve Wolfbrand says, good night, K. So I'm going to say good night also, and a good night to all of you watching on Twitter, because I think there are a lot of you watching on Twitter, because the only comments I see here are, I saw only one comment from Facebook. So probably most of the rest of you, are watching on Twitter. So good night to you. And hopefully I will see you all tomorrow night. And I'm going to end this and go over to D's now. And I urge the rest of you to join me at D's, by the way. And don't forget, I have a buymeacoffee.com/Joe.Firestone. And you can also find me on patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. So please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow night.